If you ask the average person to explain to you the relationship between history and liberty, most people will explain to you that as history has moved forward, liberty has expanded over time. We tend to tell a progressive narrative, how people have been freed from the different tyrannical obligations and censorship and restrictions on their behavior, and as we move forward, people have gained additional rights that have allowed them to live more fulfilling and freer lives. What's interesting is that while most people would tell this story about people's increased liberties and freedoms in today's world, if we look at the size and the power of the state today, it is undeniable that it has expanded to unprecedented levels throughout much of the world. And so it would seem that we have a contradiction on our hands. While most people would tell you a narrative about increasing liberty and progress and rights, they would do so while living under some of the largest and most powerful governments to ever exist in human history. In his book On Power, Bertrand De Jouvenel attempts to explain this contradiction and why it's so difficult for the average person to see. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at in today's video. De Jouvenel starts by making the observation that any state that is in competition for power is required to keep up with those around them. There are, of course, things like technological innovation that will allow you to move beyond your opponents, but in general, in order to effectively defeat and/or control their competitors, rulers need to make sure that they can extract the same amount of manpower and material resources as those they are competing against. If one nation has a citizen army of volunteers who only show up when they're called upon in an hour of need, and another nation has a professional standing army, then the only real option for the ruler of the first nation is to raise enough taxes and force enough people into military service to create their own professional fighting force. Otherwise, they are simply a sitting duck waiting to be conquered whenever the inevitable conflict arises. The same effect can be seen with historical examples like France moving to the levée en masse, where the entire country was basically subject to a draft, and other nations found it incredibly difficult to compete with a nation that had completely and totally committed itself to war. De Jouvenel points out that this basically creates a power arms race, where rulers need to become increasingly tyrannical in order to compete. If the government of one's neighbor expands, if they take rights from the people, if they become increasingly tyrannical, this often incentivizes the governments around them to do the same in order to keep pace with the military and economic prowess of their neighbors, lest they fall behind and become subject to invasion. The only thing that usually keeps this kind of power expansion arms race in check is the resistance of the people. If you push the people too hard at once, they might push back, and in that case it might make them far more difficult to rule. They could grind military and economic production to a standstill, and so there's always a delicate balance where the leader needs to extract more and more power, but do so slowly as to not trigger a response from their subjects. Now, De Jouvenel makes the same observation that we made at the beginning of this video, that while the power of government is undeniably expanding constantly, people seem to talk more and more about how they are freer than they have ever been in history. Far from having this backlash that slows down the expansion of power, people seem to believe this narrative that over time they have become more and more free, more and more liberated, they have more and more rights. And so while the government's power is expanding, the people see themselves as freer than ever. But why is this? How is it that government can continue its expansion of power, but the people not only don't see it, they don't fight back, they actually seem to think the opposite is occurring? They are fully invested in this Whig history narrative, where history will always bend towards justice and freedom and the expansion of rights and liberties, that we're making this progress to the ultimate goal of a free individual. De Jouvenel explains that the reason we can observe this contradiction where people think they are freer than they ever have been while having the largest and most powerful governments that have ever existed is because the other social organizations inside culture have diminished so much in influence. De Jouvenel says, quote, Every increase of state authority must involve an immediate diminution of the liberty of each citizen. Every augmentation of the public wealth means an immediate lopping of the revenues of each. So obvious a danger should, one would think, have an effect of uniting all in an almost unanimous opposition, by which power's advance would be surely stayed. Why is it that the opposite happens, and that we see power pursuing its triumphal way all over the pages of history? It had to remain largely invisible, and not let alarm arise at its becoming an ever larger creditor for obedience and services. But that raises a further mystery. Why is it not clear as crystal to everyone that the private citizen is falling ever more deeply into the public authority's debt for those commodities? And what is the explanation of the fact that, right down to our own time, the movement of history has in general been interpreted as a progressive liberation of the individual? The reason is that there are in societies, in addition to the state and the individual, social authorities as well, which also claim from the human being their due of obedience and services. And the diminution or disappearance of his obligations to social authorities may affect his life and stir his interest more than the aggravation of his obligations to the political authority. Every social authority rests on a basis of services and dues, and naturally, therefore, a struggle ensues between the different authorities for possession of the services and dues available. What assists the advance of the state is this, that it is at war with the others of man's masters, the abasement of whom tends to be more regarded than its own elevation. Only in an ideally simple society in which there were no social authorities would matters proceed differently." End quote. De Jouvenel is saying that with the reduction of competing spheres of social power, the state has been offered the ability to grow without really being noticed by the average person. The reduced role of things like churches, civic organizations, community, and most importantly families has made the individual feel more liberated over time. The removal of the social demands from sources other than the state has allowed the average individual far more autonomy and leisure time to use as they see fit. It also frees up a decent amount of income, which allows them to do things like go on lavish vacations or indulge deeply into niche hobbies. It also tends to free up more time to work and therefore generate more income to consume additional product at the end of a hard day. This often feels very liberating for the individual at first, though because these things tend to be meaningless in the long run, we have seen the effects this has on the populace once these amusements and novelties wear thin. Now, at first, the state tends to embrace this process in the name of liberty and equality, and starts to adopt additional roles and responsibilities like the education, transportation, and even feeding and emotional care of children, which consume a large amount of the time of their parents. This expands the infrastructure, reach, and power of the state while also reducing the duty of the individual. It can also be done in the name of leveling the playing field and giving everyone an equal chance at a successful autonomous existence. While expansion of government power will never be given as a justification for this process, it will be ongoing, and the roles of priests, parents, and organic community will be subsumed by agents of the state. State-educated therapists, teachers, and social workers will take over roles that were once held by private individuals, freeing parents, friends, relatives, and neighbors of social obligations, but also ever expanding the apparatus and power of the government. Eventually, even the increased leisure time will be consumed by the expansion of the state, because the price of this liberation was always the total state. De Jouvenel says, quote, "Where does it all lead to? This unending war waged by power against the other authorities which society throws up. Will the jaws of the great boa constrictor of human energies ever cease to close on all who in turn put these energies to their use? Where will it end? In the destruction of all other command for the benefit of one alone, that of the state. In each man's absolute freedom from every family and social authority, a freedom the price of which has been complete submission to the state. In the complete equality as between themselves of all citizens, paid for by their equal abasement before the power of their absolute master, the state." in the disappearance of every constraint which does not emanate from the state, and in the denial of every preeminence which is not approved by the state. In a word, it ends in the atomization of society, and in the rupture of every private tie linking man and man, whose only bond is now their common bondage to the state. The extremes of individualism and socialism meet. That was always their predestined course." End quote. Many libertarians and even conservatives often think that the key to reducing state power is by written rules on paper. A well-constructed constitution with Montesquieu's checks and balances and separation of powers. But the only actually successful check on the expansion of government power is competing social organizations. Stronger families, churches, and communities are the key and far more likely to be successful than simply writing down the rules and then telling everyone to live as they would like outside of them. Obviously, increasing the power of things like family and religious organizations is far easier said than done. While the state may have assisted this journey initially in the name of liberty and equality, it certainly now understands, at least at some level, that these things reduce its power, and that these organizations will need to stay crippled for its power to continue to expand. It's no accident that the majority of government policy is now directly targeted at wiping out the remnants of these social organizations. And they have no intention of allowing a revival of these kind of influences to be a speed bump to their continuing press towards totalitarian power. Thanks for watching the video, guys. If you liked it, please go ahead and click the like button. If it's your first time here and you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead and do so now. If you would like to support me on Subscribestar, like the fine people who are now being shown on screen, or if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you can go ahead and look at the links below the video. I also have a link to our merch store if you would like to buy something to support the channel there. And if you want to share out the content, that's always a great help as well. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.